The night was loud with victory, but one woman did not celebrate. Torches flickered across Macedon's stone halls, casting long shadows that bent like accusations. Alexander's empire was still warm from conquest, still bleeding from ambition. And somewhere in that noise, a woman stood perfectly still, knowing history was about to close its fist around her name. Her name was Sinaine. She had been trained to kill before most men were trusted with a sword, raised not in silk but in iron, daughter of a king, student of war, and the last person standing between Macedon and a future written only by men. Her story does not begin with glory, it begins with exclusion. From the moment she was born, Sinaine lived inside a contradiction. She was royal blood, yet barred from power. Macedonian by law, Illyrian by her mother's fierce lineage. That mattered, because Illyrian women did not bow quietly, they fought. Her father, Philip II, saw something dangerous in her. Not weakness, potential. So he did what kings rarely dared. He trained her, not in diplomacy, not in marriage, but in war. Sinaine learned to ride before she learned to write. She learned how to aim a spear at a moving target, how to dismount at full speed, how to kill without hesitation, because hesitation got you buried. She fought in battles most historians pretend never happened, not because they were small, but because she was there. By the time Alexander marched east to carve his name into the world, Sinaine stayed behind, not because she was incapable, but because her presence unsettled the order of things. A woman who knew tactics was an inconvenience. A woman who had led men into battle was a threat. Then Alexander died. No warning, no successor, just a vacuum filled with panic. Generals who had once followed orders now whispered behind pillars. Regents argued over crowns that were still dripping with blood. The empire shook, not from invasion, but from fear. And in that chaos, Sinaine moved. She did not raise an army. She did not beg for permission. She did something far more dangerous. She spoke. Sinaine crossed into the camp knowing blades were waiting. She did not carry a sword that day. She carried lineage. The soldiers saw her before the order was given. Some hesitated. Some lowered their eyes. That hesitation is important. It tells us something history often forgets. She mattered. When the command finally came, it was swift. A strike meant to be quiet, efficient, forgettable. But death does not erase truth. Her blood hit the ground, and something unexpected happened. The army stirred. Murmurs spread. Anger surfaced. They had killed a woman who had fought for them, a daughter of kings, a reminder of what courage looked like without permission. The men who ordered her death underestimated one thing: memory. Sinaine did not live to rule, but she shattered the silence that protected her killers, and in the unrest that followed, the empire began to crack. Not because of armies, not because of enemies, but because one woman refused to disappear quietly. If this story feels unfinished, good. It is not meant to be comfortable. Because what followed her death reshaped power, succession, and fear across the ancient world. And the men who thought killing her solved their problem soon learned some legacies grow louder after the blade falls. If stories like this pull you in, quiet power, erased names, history that still breathes, stay close. The next chapter cuts deeper. Cynane's body had barely cooled when the consequences began. Death was supposed to end her influence. That was the logic. Remove the woman, remove the problem. But blood does not stay silent. The camp that night was restless. Men who had followed orders without question now whispered in clusters. Veterans stared into fires and said nothing, their silence heavier than protest. Because this had not been an enemy killed in battle. This had been a royal woman cut down for speaking aloud what many feared to think. And fear spreads faster than loyalty. By dawn, the generals realized something had gone wrong. The army was no longer unified by obedience, it was unified by unease. Soldiers remembered Cynane on horseback, armor dusted with road grime, riding like one of them. They remembered her voice, calm, sharp, unafraid. They remembered that she had never asked for protection. Now she was gone, and the ground felt unstable. When her daughter was brought forward, something shifted. Not sympathy, recognition. The girl was young, but her posture betrayed her lineage. She did not weep, she did not beg. That alone terrified the men who had ordered Cynane's death. Because this was how it started, with a woman who would not look down. The generals argued behind closed tents, voices low and urgent. They spoke of stability, of order, of preventing chaos. But their words rang hollow. They had already caused the chaos. The soldiers were watching, waiting. In an empire stitched together by conquest, the army was the spine. Break its trust, and everything slumped. The murmurs grew louder. Not rebellion, yet. Something more dangerous. Expectation. The men wanted compensation, not in gold, in acknowledgement. They demanded that Cynane's daughter be honored, not as queen, not as a ruler, but as legitimate. It was a compromise born of fear. The same men who had ordered a quiet murder now scrambled to rewrite its meaning. They dressed the decision in ceremony. They spoke of unity. They pretended this outcome had always been the plan. But soldiers remember truth better than speeches. The girl was married into power, bound tightly, carefully, like a blade wrapped in cloth, not erased, contained. And for a moment it seemed to work. The army settled, the fires burned lower, the empire exhaled. But the damage was done, because once authority reveals its hand, it cannot hide it again. The generals had shown the world something vital. Bloodlines mattered only when convenient. Women were acceptable symbols until they spoke. Strength was praised until it challenged control. Cynane's death became a lesson whispered from camp to camp, a warning not to women, but to men who believed power was stable. From that point on, loyalty thinned. Alliances became temporary. Promises grew sharp edges. Every regent began sleeping lighter. And somewhere inside the palace walls, Cynane's daughter learned the truth her mother never lived long enough to teach her fully. Survival in an empire like this did not depend on courage alone. It depended on patience, on silence, on knowing when to disappear and when not to. Cynane had chosen not to. That choice echoed, not in monuments, not in official histories, but in every uneasy glance exchanged by men who now understood something irreversible had happened. They had crossed a line, and lines once crossed never stop moving. The empire still stood, the banners still flew, but beneath them the foundations had cracked, and cracks, no matter how small, always widen. What followed was not immediate collapse, but something far more dangerous: decay. And decay, once begun, is patient. Empires rarely fall when the ground shakes. They fall when the ground stops feeling solid. After Cinnane's death, nothing collapsed immediately. That was the lie that kept everyone calm. The tents still stood. The orders still moved down the chain. The banners still caught the wind. But trust, real trust, was gone. The generals began watching one another the way soldiers watch the tree line before an ambush. Too alert, too careful. Every decision now carried a second meaning. They had learned something dangerous. A single woman, unarmed, had forced the army to blink. So they tightened control. Meetings grew smaller. Messages became coded. Power retreated inward, like a fist slowly closing. And yet, the more they tried to contain the aftermath, the more it leaked. Because Cinnae had not just challenged authority, she had revealed its fear. The soldiers felt it first. Men who had crossed deserts and rivers without question now hesitated at orders that smelled of convenience rather than necessity. They followed commands, but with eyes open, and an empire cannot survive an army that thinks. Far away from the camps, the consequences spread quietly. In courtrooms, in marriages arranged too quickly, in titles granted to men who had done nothing to earn them except survive. Cinnae's daughter was watched constantly, not guarded, watched. Every word she spoke was weighed, every silence noted. She had learned from her mother's end what truth cost, so she adapted. She smiled when expected, she bowed when required. She became exactly what the empire wanted her to be. And that made her dangerous in a different way, because the generals mistook silence for surrender. Meanwhile, the men who had ordered Cinnae's death found no peace. They slept, but lightly. They ate, but without appetite. They had killed someone the army respected, not loved, respected. That distinction matters. Respect lingers. It corrodes certainty. Every time unrest flared in a distant province, they wondered if this was the moment it all came back. Every rumor felt sharper. Every messenger late by an hour felt like betrayal. The empire became reactive. And reactive empires make mistakes. Small ones at first, a delayed payment, a slighted officer, a marriage alliance that failed to hold. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth recording in official histories. But history is not built from official records. It is built from accumulation, from the weight of many small fractures pressing down on the same weak point. Cinnae had been that point. She had shown that legitimacy could be questioned, that power could be confronted without an army, that blood mattered, but only if people believed it did. The belief had shifted. Not enough to crown a woman, not enough to revolt, enough to doubt. and doubt is lethal to empires that rely on inevitability. Years later, when wars of succession tore the empire into pieces, chroniclers would blame ambition, greed, ego. They would not mention synone. They would not mention the moment the army murmured instead of obeyed, or the day a woman died and the men who killed her lost something they could never reclaim. But the shape of the threat remained, invisible, persistent, waiting. Because once people realize power can be challenged, they never forget it. And the empire that killed Synone would spend the rest of its life trying and failing to unlearn that lesson. What came next was not rebellion, but inheritance. And inheritance, when poisoned, never stays contained. Time did what blades could not. It softened the memory without erasing it. Years passed. New campaigns arose. Old generals fell. Maps were redrawn by hands that pretended the past had been settled. But beneath the noise of war and succession, something endured. A question: who had the right to rule? Before Synane, the answer had been simple, at least on the surface. Power flowed downward from conquest, wrapped in bloodlines, sealed by force. After her death, that certainty thinned, not shattered, thinned, and thin things tear easily. The men who inherited command learned to speak carefully. They learned to flatter the army, to invoke Alexander's name like a prayer, even as they betrayed his vision piece by piece. But no name carries power forever. The empire became a thing of habits rather than belief, ritual without conviction, authority without awe. And when belief dies, inheritance becomes dangerous. Synane's daughter lived longer than her mother, long enough to understand what survival required. She did not challenge the throne. She did not raise her voice. She raised heirs, children shaped by whispers, by stories told late at night when guards were distant and truth felt safer. Stories of a grandmother who had refused to kneel. Stories of a woman who had walked into death without armor. These were not heroic tales. They were warnings, and warnings endure. Across the fractured empire, other women listened. Queens by marriage, mothers of heirs, regents who ruled while men marched and died. They learned the lesson Synane had paid for. Do not confront power head-on. Do not announce your claim. Shape the future quietly. Marriages became weapons. Bloodlines became leverage. Children became insurance. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation, the kind that leaves no clean enemy to strike. Men still fought wars, still killed for thrones, still carved kingdoms out of old borders, but the foundations were shifting beneath them. Because once authority kills legitimacy to protect itself, it admits a truth it can never retract, that rule is fragile. The successors sensed it. They felt it in the way cities hesitated before opening gates, in the way soldiers asked for guarantees instead of trusting oaths. Every ruler after Synane inherited not just an empire, but a suspicion that power could be challenged by presence alone, by blood alone, by refusal alone. They tried to bury that suspicion under monuments and proclamations. They built statues of men with spears and crowns. They did not carve Sinane's face in stone. But absence speaks, especially in history. When the empire finally fractured beyond repair, no single moment marked its death. There was no final battle, no single betrayal, just a long unraveling. And in that unraveling, the ghost of Sinane remained, not as a martyr, not as a symbol, but as a question no one had dared to answer honestly. What if authority is not inherited through force, but remembered through courage? That question haunted every successor who sat on an unstable throne, every general who wondered whether the army would still follow, every ruler who slept surrounded by guards and still felt alone. Sinane had died, but the idea she embodied had survived the blade, and ideas, once bloodied, do not die easily. The final reckoning was never about revenge, but what history chooses to remember and what it pretends never happened. There is a moment after violence when the world does not immediately respond. No thunder, no judgment, just quiet. That silence is deceptive. Long after Sinane's name stopped being spoken aloud, its echo remained, not in songs, not in laws, but in behavior. The successors of Alexander ruled cautiously, too cautiously. They surrounded themselves with titles and ceremonies, trying to recreate inevitability. But inevitability cannot be staged. Every ruler feared the same thing, not invasion, not assassination, but legitimacy questioned in public. Because Sinane had proven something unforgivable. You did not need an army to threaten power. You needed recognition, and recognition spreads faster than fear. The empire became obsessed with control over narrative. Chroniclers were rewarded for omission. Poets learned which names to avoid. History was curated, trimmed, and polished until it looked seamless. Sinane vanished from official memory, but silence is not forgetting, it is management. Her absence became instructive. Women at court noticed which behaviors were punished and which were tolerated. They learned how to influence without being seen, how to survive without standing at the center. Power shifted sideways. Mothers shaped kings. Wives softened decrees. Regents delayed wars. All of it quiet. All of it intentional. The men believed they still ruled absolutely, and in a narrow sense they did. But the certainty was gone. Because once authority teaches people what not to say, it also teaches them what not to believe. The empire fractured into successor kingdoms ruled by men who claimed Alexander's mantle but lacked his myth. They fought one another endlessly, each convinced they were restoring order. None of them were. Their wars were smaller, their victories temporary, their legacies unstable. And in those fractured courts, Sinane's lesson endured. Open defiance invites annihilation. Quiet influence reshapes generations. This was not triumph, it was endurance. Sinane had lost her life. Her bloodline survived, but not unscarred. Her victory, if it could be called that, was subtle. History does not reward subtlety. So her name faded, but her impact did not.
because every empire leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves behind habits, the habit of fear, the habit of silence, the habit of ruling without trust. Those habits outlived the banners. When the last of Alexander's successor states fell centuries later, no one mentioned Sine. They spoke of Rome, of legions, of inevitability. But inevitability is always written by the victors, and the victors inherited a world already shaped by quieter losses. The silence after Sine's death was not empty. It was loaded with lessons, with caution, with memory disguised as restraint. And history moved forward carrying that weight, unseen, uncredited, unchallenged. One part remained: how history itself decided who deserved to be remembered and who was easier to erase.
History likes clean endings: a crown placed, a treaty signed, a body buried. Sine received none of these. When the dust finally settled and Alexander's empire dissolved into quarreling kingdoms, the chroniclers did their work. They sorted events, they named winners, they simplified causes. And Sine did not fit. She was inconvenient, too bold to be ignored, too dangerous to be celebrated, too undeniable to be fully erased. So history did what it often does best. It minimized. A sentence here, a footnote there, a passing mention, stripped of weight, stripped of consequence. A woman who had trained soldiers became the daughter of. A woman who had confronted generals became the mother of. A woman who had forced an empire to react became an aside. This was not an accident. This was design. Because history is not only written by victors, it is edited by survivors. And survivors rarely preserve stories that expose their fear. Yet erasure is never complete. Sine lingered in the margins, in contradictions scholars could not fully explain, in sudden concessions that made no sense without her, in political marriages that appeared rushed, in armies that reacted too strongly to quiet dissent. Her absence left fingerprints. The truth is, Sine lost. She did not rule. She did not reform the empire. She did not live to see justice. But victory is not the same as impact. She forced power to reveal itself. She made authority show its hand. And once that happens, it can never again pretend to be unquestioned. Every ruler who came after governed with one additional fear: not armies, not rivals, exposure.
The fear that someone might stand where Sine stood, unarmed, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. That fear shaped decisions, delayed actions, softened decrees. It weakened certainty, and certainty is the true backbone of empire. Without it, power must constantly justify itself, defend itself, explain itself. That is not strength. That is erosion. Sine became part of that erosion, not celebrated, not remembered properly, but effective. There is a reason stories like hers feel unfinished, uncomfortable, unresolved, because they are not about triumph, they are about cost. She paid with her life so others could learn how fragile authority truly was, how quickly legitimacy collapses when confronted by someone who refuses to accept silence as law. History prefers martyrs who die beautifully. Sinane died inconveniently, and so she was buried twice, once in the earth and once in narrative. But buried things shape the ground above them. Empires rose afterward, empires fell, and every one of them carried the same quiet anxiety, that power, when challenged by truth rather than force, is never as solid as it claims. Sinane did not leave monuments, she left consequences, and those consequences outlived the men who killed her. So when history tells you the story of kings and conquerors, listen carefully to what it leaves out, because sometimes the most dangerous person in an empire is not the one who wins, but the one whose refusal still echoes long after the record goes quiet. If you're still here, you understand something most people miss. History is not only shaped by those who ruled, but by those it had to silence. And some silences are louder than any crown.